10 years ago, the luxury cruise liner Azure Horizon vanished without a trace along a remote stretch of ocean. No survivors, no wreckage, no answers. Now, a battered lifeboat containing haunting evidence washes ashore on a desolate beach, triggering a reopened investigation that peels back the layers of a conspiracy far more chilling than anyone dared imagine. At the center of it all, a woman whose brother was aboard, a disgraced maritime investigator, and a town desperate to keep its secrets buried. The storm had been punishing the coastline for hours by the time Mark Jennings spotted something snagged between the rocks. The surf pounded the shore in furious, misty gusts, and his boots sank deep into the wet sand with every step. He shielded his eyes against the sting of salt water and squinted. At first glance, it looked like wreckage, another casualty of the sea's temper. But as he drew closer, his heart gave a sharp, almost boyish jolt. It wasn't just driftwood or fishing gear, it was a lifeboat. The hull was cracked, its paint peeled back like old skin. The bow, half buried in a nest of seaweed and broken shells, bore a name still faintly visible beneath the grime: Azure Horizon. Mark stumbled backward instinctively, as if the thing might lurch to life. His mind raced back a decade to endless news broadcasts and teary vigils held in town halls. Everyone had assumed the Azure Horizon had been swallowed whole by the sea, her fate sealed in silence. No wreckage had ever been found, until now. "Hey!" he shouted over his shoulder, waving to a younger man battling the wind, carrying a radio. "Get the sheriff down here, now!" Together they circled the battered lifeboat. A thick layer of algae and barnacles coated the underside, proof that it had spent years adrift. The top hatch had buckled open, likely from impact. Mark pulled out a flashlight and directed the beam inside. It was then he saw the skeletal hand, brittle and yellowing, still curled around a bundle of sodden paper. He cursed under his breath and took a step back. For the first time in a long while, Mark Jennings felt something he hadn't since he was a boy, telling ghost stories around a fire. Pure, bone-deep fear. Across town, Clara Hayes's phone vibrated against the kitchen counter, sending ripples through the half-drunk cup of coffee beside it, the cheap, chipped mug Liam had always favored. She didn't rush to answer. Mornings had become a ritual of stillness, a fragile shield built against the sharp edges of memory. No television, no social media feeds, no phone calls unless absolutely necessary. She preferred it that way. When she finally glanced at the screen, a pit formed in her stomach. Unknown number. Old instincts flickered to life, the same ones she'd spent years smothering. She let it ring once more before answering. "This is Clara." The voice on the other end was strained, almost apologetic. "Miss Hayes, this is Deputy Miller from Stone Harbor County. We found something. You'll want to come down to Whisperwind Cove." "What is it?" she asked immediately, bracing herself. There was a pause. "A lifeboat. From the Azure Horizon." Clara pressed the heel of her hand into the counter to steady herself. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She couldn't. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, she managed, her voice low. The roads were still slick with rain when Clara arrived. Deputies had roped off a wide perimeter with yellow tape, and a few curious locals lingered beyond the barriers, murmuring among themselves. Clara parked in a hurry and approached the scene, her old press badge tucked into her jacket pocket, more out of habit than necessity. The ocean was a wild, restless thing behind the wreckage, foaming and pulling at the shore like it meant to reclaim what it had lost. And there it was, the lifeboat wedged between two jagged outcrops, as if the sea had finally spat it back in disgust. Deputy Miller met her halfway up the beach. He was a young man, maybe 30, his uniform still damp from the rain. "Miss Hayes," he greeted. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I had to," Clara said simply. He nodded once, then gestured toward the lifeboat. "We haven't moved it yet, waiting for state investigators. But you should see this." He led her to the hatch. Clara crouched, careful not to slip on the wet stones. Her breath caught when she saw it. The skeleton was crumpled awkwardly against the inner hull, its tattered clothing still clinging in places. The journal, swollen with seawater, was gripped so tightly that the bones of the hand had warped around it. It wasn't just evidence, it was a message, a cry for help that had taken 10 long years to reach land. Clara rose slowly, brushing the sand from her knees. The memories came flooding back. The day Liam had boarded the azure horizon, waving from the gangway, oblivious to the weight his absence would carve into her life, the empty funeral, the theories, pirates, freak storms, mechanical failure, the pitying looks. Now, standing here, she felt that wound reopen, raw and angry. "Have they identified the remains?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Miller shook his head. "No, won't be able to for a while." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's something off about all of this. Sheriff Brody thinks it's probably just a fluke. The currents finally coughed it up." "But you don't think so?" Clara said quietly. Miller gave her a sidelong glance. "Look at it. That boat didn't just drift in yesterday, and that journal, it's not just notes or a log, it's something else. You'll see." Clara nodded, her mind already racing ahead. She wasn't about to wait for the authorities to shuffle through red tape. She needed to see that journal, needed to know what it said. An hour later, after a tense negotiation and some fast talking, Clara found herself in the sheriff's temporary field tent, standing over a steel examination table where the journal had been laid out carefully, page by crumbling page. Most of it was illegible, the ink long since bled into smudges. But there were pieces, snatches of writing that survived. "Don't trust the crew." Something in the lower hold. "Whispers at night. Deep man watches." Clara's fingers hovered just above the paper, afraid to touch it. A chill skated down her spine. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with a face worn into permanent skepticism, leaned back in his chair. "It's probably just hallucination, you know. Cabin fever, isolation, fear. Happens all the time." Clara didn't answer right away. She studied the sheriff's face, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, the way Deputy Miller kept shifting uncomfortably in the background. Maybe it was just weathered wreckage washing ashore after a decade. Maybe it was a meaningless accident finally surrendering its last secret. But Clara didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. Something happened out there, and she was going to find out what. The footage played out in Clara's mind, the way it had 1,000 times before, a memory stitched together from newscasts, survivor theories, and her own imagination. It was the afternoon of May 18th, 2015. The azure horizon had been midway through a 7-day tropical cruise, cutting through calm waters beneath a cloudless sky. Passengers lounged by the pool, children shrieked with laughter, and couples toasted champagne on the open decks. The last radio contact was routine. The captain, Captain Roth, had checked in with the port authority, reporting all systems normal and a slight course adjustment to avoid a weather disturbance hundreds of miles south. No distress signal ever followed. At 3:12 p.m., the ship's transponder, the electronic beacon that tracked its position, went silent. Not jammed, not slowly fading, just gone. Rescue planes scoured hundreds of miles of open water for weeks. Sonar sweeps came up empty. Satellite imagery offered no clues. It was as if the ocean had opened its jaws and swallowed the azure horizon whole, leaving behind not so much as a floating life jacket. The families were left with apologies, with half-hearted memorials, with silence. Clara leaned back in her chair at the kitchen table, the journal pages spread out before her, and stared into the empty space of her apartment. Guilt pressed against her chest, like a hand refusing to let go. It had been her idea. She remembered the phone call with painful clarity. Liam on the fence about taking time off work, worried about expenses he hadn't wanted to go. "You deserve it," she had insisted, laughing into the receiver.
"Come on, Liam, it'll be the adventure of a lifetime. You never do anything for yourself." He'd caved, booked the trip 2 days later, sent her a selfie from the dock, grinning like a kid, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. He had trusted her. When the news broke that the ship had vanished, it had taken Clara weeks to stop answering her phone, expecting his voice on the other end. Even now, 10 years later, she hadn't forgiven herself.
Finding the lifeboat, seeing the journal, it felt like a summons, like a second chance she didn't deserve but couldn't ignore. She closed the file of notes and stood, reaching for her keys. There was someone she needed to see, someone who might still have answers. Ethan Cole lived on the outskirts of town in a weathered single-story house, shielded by a forest of gnarled pine trees. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and an old battered truck sat rusting under a tarp. Clara parked at the curb and hesitated before stepping out, a knot tightening in her stomach. She hadn't seen Ethan since the early days of the search, back when he'd been the face of the investigation, a young maritime investigator with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak that didn't endear him to his superiors. He'd believed something was wrong from the beginning, believed the ship hadn't simply sunk or capsized by accident. And for that, he'd been punished, the whispers costing him not just his job, but the quiet confidence he once wore easily. Clara walked up the gravel path and knocked. It took a full minute before the door cracked open. Ethan stood there, older now, but still wiry and alert. His dark hair was streaked with grey at the temples, and his eyes, once bright and restless, were quieter, somehow shadowed. When he saw her, his brow furrowed, recognition mixing with something unreadable. "Clara Hayes," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered. "Didn't expect you." The air between them felt thick with unspoken history. "I found something," she said without preamble. Or rather, they found something. Ethan didn't invite her in right away. He glanced past her at the empty street, then back at her face, searching. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of Ethan's house was cluttered but not dirty. Folders and maps were stacked in precarious towers on every surface. A large corkboard dominated one wall, covered in faded photographs, notes, and a grim series of timelines, a testament to an obsession he clearly hadn't abandoned. Clara sat at the kitchen table while Ethan poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. He slid one toward her without asking how she took it. "What did you find?" he asked, taking the seat across from her. "A lifeboat," Clara said. She pushed a printed photo across the table, a grainy shot of the Azure Horizon logo still clinging to the battered hull. "And a journal." Ethan's fingers lingered on the edge of the photograph. His face didn't change, but something in his posture sharpened. "They said it was coincidence," Clara added, her voice low. "But I don't buy it." Ethan leaned back. "No, neither do I." She told him everything then, the skeletal remains, the journal entries mentioning the deep man, the strange behavior of the local sheriff. When she finished, Ethan tapped the photo once with his index finger. "I warned them back then. Something about that cruise wasn't right. The manifest didn't match. Too much equipment loaded for a pleasure trip. But they shut me down, said I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Chasing phantoms." He grimaced slightly. Some sonar readings near the suspected zone were odd, dismissed as geological anomalies or equipment malfunction. "You think someone wanted the ship to disappear?" Clara asked. Ethan met her gaze. "I think someone made sure it did." The rain had started again, tapping lightly against the windows. Clara clasped her hands around the coffee mug, feeling the old anger rising beneath her skin. Anger at the authorities who gave up, anger at the world for moving on, anger at herself for letting it all fade. "They'll bury this again," she said quietly, "if we don't do something." Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You're serious?" She nodded. "I need your help. I can't do this alone." He was silent for a moment. Then he reached for a battered folder from a pile near the window, flipping it open to reveal a map of the coastal waters around the last known coordinates of the azure horizon. "Good," he said, a flicker of the old fire returning to his eyes. "Because I never stopped looking." The old investigator in him, the man who had once refused to back down, was still there, flickering back to life. Clara leaned forward, the first threads of determination stitching themselves into something stronger. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter what was waiting for them beneath the surface. Did the azure horizon truly vanish without a trace? Or was there a deeper conspiracy at play? And how did a lifeboat resurface after 10 long years? Ethan adjusted the reading lamp until the light fell evenly across the pages, spread out over his kitchen table. He and Clara had spent the better part of the afternoon carefully separating the surviving sheets from the journal, placing each one between layers of parchment paper to dry. Most were hopelessly smudged, black ink leaching into the fibers like spiderwebs. But a few, a precious few, remained legible. Clara leaned over the nearest sheet, her elbows tucked tightly to her sides. The handwriting was cramped, desperate, as if whoever had written it had been fighting the motion of the sea. Crew restless. Orders changed last minute. Captain Roth no longer trusted. Midnight meetings on lower deck. What are they hiding? Clara glanced at Ethan. "You said the manifests were wrong. Too much equipment." He nodded slowly, tracing a finger over the words, "lower deck." And the captain, Roth, he wasn't originally assigned to that voyage. They brought him in 3 days before departure. No explanation, no public statement. Clara frowned. She remembered Liam mentioning the captain briefly in his last call, something about him seeming distracted, tense. At the time, she thought little of it. Now it gnawed at her. Ethan reached for another page, one stained but readable in parts. Whispers in the hallways. Talk of deep man. Not safe after dark. He set the page down carefully. "The deep man," he said aloud, tasting the words. "Sounds like a campfire story. Maritime boogeyman." Clara shook her head. "No, it feels deliberate. A distraction. Fear makes people easier to control. If you want to keep a crew in line, invent something worse than the truth." Ethan gave her a long, approving look. "You're thinking like an investigator." "I'm thinking like someone who's tired of being lied to," she said quietly. It started small, the kind of things that could be dismissed if you weren't already looking for patterns. Clara's phone rang just after midnight. She answered on the first ring, expecting Ethan or perhaps another deputy with updates. But there was only silence, not the cold, empty kind, but something worse, the faint, crackling distortion of a line connected but not speaking. After a long moment, the call ended without a sound. 2 nights later, she spotted strange lights offshore while walking along the cliffs, 3 pulsing glows, too low to be stars and too rhythmic to be natural. They disappeared the moment she tried to capture them on her phone. Meanwhile, Ethan's truck, parked outside the town archives, had its tires slashed in broad daylight. No witnesses, no security footage. Each incident alone could have been chance. Together they formed a pattern Clara couldn't ignore. Someone, or something, didn't want them digging deeper. Back at Ethan's house, they hunched over an old nautical chart, the edges frayed and curling. Ethan had plotted the coordinates of the azure horizon's last known location. Next to it, he drew a series of arcs radiating toward the coast, representing 10 years of potential drift patterns based on currents, tides, and storms. "The lifeboat was found here," Ethan said, tapping a spot with a pencil. "Whisperwind Cove." Clara leaned closer. "That's a lot farther north than it should be, right?" He nodded grimly. "Way farther, unless—" The ship didn't vanish where they said it did. Clara's mind raced. "You're saying it sank closer to shore?" Ethan traced a slow line with the pencil, connecting possible drift paths. "Much closer, maybe within 60 miles, small enough to miss if you're looking in the wrong place, especially if you're told not to look too hard." Clara stared at the map, her stomach turning over. All that time, all those families, they were searching in the wrong ocean. Ethan sat back, exhaling through his nose. Someone wanted it that way.
Wreckage would have been recoverable back then. Survivors might have been found. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in town shifted. Locals who had once been eager to share gossip now turned away when Clara approached. The owners of the marina, who had agreed to lease them a small boat for offshore searching, cancelled the rental at the last minute, citing insurance concerns.
Ethan's internet connection at home became unstable. Documents disappeared from shared folders, corrupted files appearing in their place. When Clara called the sheriff's office to request copies of the original Azure Horizon investigation reports, she was politely stonewalled. The message was clear: stop, or else. But fear was a currency Clara had already spent a long time ago. She wasn't going to be bought off now. One evening, as they reviewed sonar charts by the dim light of Ethan's living room, Clara sat back and rubbed her eyes. "They're trying to scare us into quitting." Ethan didn't look up from the map. "That's what you do when you're hiding something worth killing for." The decision came as naturally as breathing. They couldn't stop. Clara leaned forward, tracing her finger over the cluster of drift lines that all seemed to converge near an underwater trench, an area of treacherous currents, deep drop-offs, and a reputation for wrecking ships even in good weather. The abyss. It made sense. It made too much sense. "We find the wreck," she said, voice steady. "We find out what really happened." Ethan nodded. He had already pulled out an old contact list: divers, salvage crews, sonar specialists he still trusted. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be cheap, and it would definitely make them even bigger targets. But the alternative, to turn their backs on the truth now, was unthinkable. Ethan folded the map carefully and slipped it into a weatherproof case. "We'll need gear, a boat, and a hell of a lot of luck." Clara smiled thinly. "I've been owed a little luck for a long time." Outside, the wind howled against the pines, carrying with it the faint, briny scent of the sea, the same sea that had hidden the azure horizon for a decade. But not much longer. The sun barely crested the horizon by the time Clara and Ethan pulled into Port Caldwell. The coastal town, once bustling with tourists and shipping traffic, now felt hollowed out. Paint peeled from the sides of seafood shops, and the marina groaned under the weight of rusted vessels bobbing in choppy waters. Clara pulled her jacket tighter against the cold spray carried in from the sea. Every corner of this place felt like a memory frayed by time and something else. They parked near the harbour master's office, a squat, aging building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old coffee. The woman behind the counter barely glanced up from her ledger. "We're looking for shipping records from May 2015, Ethan said, his tone casual, "specifically for the Azure Horizon." The woman hesitated for a beat, barely perceptible, but Clara caught it. She pointed down the hall. "Third door on the left, archives." They thanked her and moved down the narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing softly off the concrete walls. The archives room looked like it hadn't been touched in years. File boxes were stacked to the ceiling, some collapsing under their own weight. Dust hung thick in the air, coating everything in a thin grey film. Ethan pulled out a clipboard listing standard shipping documents, cargo manifests, crew rosters, maintenance logs, and they began methodically working through the shelves. It didn't take long for the holes to appear. Clara found a shipping manifest labelled for May 16th, the Azure Horizon's departure day, but it listed only food, linen, and entertainment supplies. No mention of the heavy machinery Ethan remembered seeing loaded onto the vessel. As she scanned the page, her finger brushed against a faint smudge in the bottom corner, almost like an erased logo, a stylized trident she vaguely recognized but couldn't place. She made a mental note. Other documents were worse, incomplete, unsigned, or missing entirely. Several sheets were clear reprints, not originals, with formatting inconsistencies that stood out even to Clara's untrained eye. Ethan held up a crew roster with a frown. "No medical officer listed, on a ship carrying over 2,000 passengers. That's not an oversight." Clara shook her head, frustration prickling her skin. They sanitized it. Whoever pulled this off knew exactly what they were erasing. A sinking feeling lodged itself in her chest. If the records had been tampered with this thoroughly, it meant the truth had been buried long before the search even began. Back outside, they walked the length of the marina. Fishermen packed away gear, casting wary glances their way, conversations drying up as they passed. At the end of the pier, a man in a faded green jacket smoked a cigarette, watching the gulls squabble over discarded bait. Ethan approached first. "We're looking for information about the Azure Horizon," he said, voice easy. "Heard some of the old crew stuck around." The man snorted, flicking ash into the water. "Most smart ones left town, but there's one, if you believe the rumors." Clara leaned in. "Who?" The man shrugged, a flicker of something, caution maybe, passing over his face. "Beckett, first officer back then. Folks say he's holed up north, doesn't talk to no one. Probably for good reason." He didn't offer more. They didn't push. But it was enough. Finding Beckett wasn't easy. They left the main highway, weaving along narrower and narrower back roads until the truck could go no further. The rest they covered on foot, the trail little more than a suggestion, through dense, damp woods. Clara's boots slipped twice on moss-covered stones. Ahead, Ethan moved with careful determination, scanning the forest for any signs of habitation. Finally, they saw it, a sagging cabin nestled among thick pines, its roof bowed under the weight of years. Smoke rose from a chimney in a thin, uncertain line. They approached slowly, making no sudden moves. Ethan knocked twice. The door creaked open, revealing a man who looked less like an officer and more like a ghost, lean, hollow-eyed, beard rough and grey. "Captain Beckett?" He stared at them, suspicion thick in his expression.
"You shouldn't have come," he said, voice low and rough from disuse. Clara stepped forward. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just have questions about the Azure Horizon." Beckett didn't move to let them in, but he didn't close the door either. Finally, he stepped back. 1 minute, that's all. The inside of the cabin was cluttered but meticulously organized. Maps pinned to the walls, nautical charts scattered across a battered desk. A wood stove crackled quietly in the corner.
Beckett didn't sit. He stayed near the door, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You think you're the first to come asking," he said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "You're not." Ethan kept his voice steady. "We just want the truth." Beckett laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The truth?" "The truth got locked away with the ship." He paced a slow circle around the room. There was cargo on board, cargo that had no business being on a cruise ship. Heavy equipment, mining tech, deep-sea salvage. The passengers were just a cover, a distraction. Clara listened intently, piecing together the parts she hadn't known she was missing. Beckett continued, his voice dropping. They didn't plan for what happened next. Some kind of failure, equipment malfunction, maybe structural damage. I don't know. But when it started going wrong, he trailed off, shaking his head. Ethan leaned in. The company covered it up. Beckett met his eyes, something raw flashing across his face. They buried it, so deep even the ocean couldn't cough it back up, and they made sure anyone who knew better stayed silent. Clara tightened her hands into fists at her sides. Liam had been caught in the middle of all this, sacrificed to keep profits and reputations intact. Beckett stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Walk away. Don't think you're safe because you're asking polite questions. They're still watching. Always." They didn't stay long. Beckett made it clear he wouldn't say more, not because he didn't want to, but because he was terrified. As they made their way back down the muddy path, the air seemed heavier. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves made Clara's shoulders tighten. When they reached the truck, Ethan paused, scanning the tree line. There, half hidden by the woods, a car sat idling. Black windows, too dark to see inside. Clara's breath caught. "That wasn't there before," she said under her breath. Ethan didn't reply. He opened the driver's side door and got in with calm, deliberate movements. Clara mirrored him, forcing her hands to stay steady. The truck rumbled to life, pulling back onto the road. The black car didn't move immediately, but when they looked in the rearview mirror a few miles later, it was there, a dark smudge in the distance, following at a measured pace. The drive back into town was silent, both of them alert for any sign they were still being followed. Clara kept glancing in the side mirror, but after a few turns through side streets and a detour through a crowded grocery parking lot, the black car was gone, or at least out of sight. By the time Clara pulled up to her apartment complex, night had fallen in earnest. The street lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting weak pools of orange onto the cracked sidewalk. She cut the engine, unease prickling at the base of her spine. Ethan parked down the block and offered a small nod. "I'll wait here." Clara nodded back, grateful. She made her way up the stairs, fishing her keys out of her jacket pocket. The door to her apartment stood slightly ajar. She froze. The wood around the lock was splintered, the frame twisted inward. A hollow ache bloomed in her chest as she pushed the door open wider, revealing the chaos inside. Drawers overturned, books scattered across the floor, her laptop ripped open, the hard drive gutted. And the journal, the carefully dried and preserved pages they had left on her dining table, gone. Clara stepped inside, carefully avoiding the shattered remains of a lamp. Every instinct screamed at her that whoever had done this hadn't been looking for money or valuables. They'd been after something very specific. Behind her, Ethan entered cautiously, scanning the wreckage with a practiced eye. "They were thorough," he muttered. Clara moved quickly to the small closet near her bedroom. She pulled down an innocuous-looking shoebox and popped open the false bottom. Inside, neatly stacked and sealed in a plastic envelope, were color copies of every page from the journal. Her hands didn't tremble as she held them out to Ethan. They didn't get everything. They spent the night cleaning up what they could. Clara refused to call the police. She knew how that would go. Endless forms, shrugged shoulders, no real investigation. By morning, the adrenaline had burned itself into a hard, cold resolve. They needed more than old pages and ghost stories. They needed confirmation. Ethan had a contact, a man named Silas Croft, a retired sonar technician who had worked search and rescue missions along the eastern seaboard. They met him at a rundown diner on the edge of town. Silas was wiry, with hands that trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee. His eyes, though, were sharp, wary. "You're asking about bad business," he said without preamble, after Ethan explained what they were chasing. "We just want the truth," Clara said. Silas stirred his coffee absently, the spoon clinking against the ceramic mug. 5 years ago," he said finally, "my crew picked up something strange on a deep-sea sonar sweep about 100 miles offshore. Static, mostly, garbled frequencies, but there was a pattern to it." Clara leaned in. "What kind of pattern?" Silas's lips twisted into a grim line. "Morse code, SOS." Ethan stiffened. "You're sure?" Silas nodded slowly. "We recorded it, played it back a dozen times. The higher-ups told us it was cross-channel interference, probably from a freighter. They made us delete the tapes." His gaze flickered towards the window. "Waste of good data," they said. Clara's mind raced. Could it have come from the azure horizon? Silas hesitated, then pulled a small notepad from his jacket. He scribbled a few coordinates and slid the paper across the table. "You didn't hear it from me, and if you're smart, you'll leave it buried." Back in Ethan's truck, Clara unfolded the paper carefully. The coordinates pointed to a region sailors called the Abyss, an underwater trench notorious for violent currents and sudden drop-offs. Clara studied the map Ethan pulled up on his tablet. The Abyss was a scar across the seabed, a wound gouged deep into the Earth's crust, hidden under miles of shifting, unpredictable waters. "If the azure horizon went down there," Ethan said quietly, "it explains why no one ever found her." Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "And why they wanted the search to fail." A ship sunk in the Abyss wouldn't just vanish, it would be swallowed, crushed under unimaginable pressure. Even sophisticated recovery efforts would struggle against those depths. And yet, somehow, 5 years later, there had been an SOS. Clara tapped the screen, feeling the weight of it all settling on her shoulders. "We need to see it for ourselves." Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded. The next 2 days passed in a blur of logistics and closed-door meetings. Ethan leveraged old contacts to secure a charter boat willing to take them out that far, no questions asked. It wasn't easy. The Abyss's reputation made seasoned sailors uneasy, and the few willing to go demanded double the normal rate. They settled on a vessel called the Sea Serpent, a weather-beaten fishing trawler with reinforced hulls, and a captain who didn't blink at their request for off-grid travel. Clara arranged for sonar equipment through a local salvage company under the guise of a private research survey. She avoided using her real name whenever possible. Meanwhile, the feeling of being watched grew. Phone calls that dropped into static, unmarked cars parked a little too long outside her building, a man in a suit lingering by the dock one afternoon, pretending to check his watch, disappearing when Ethan approached. They were running out of time. If someone wanted them scared, it wasn't working. It was only hardening their resolve. The sea serpent pushed away from the docks under a heavy grey sky, its engine coughing to life before settling into a low, steady hum. Clara stood near the bow, gripping the cold railing as the shoreline of Port Caldwell shrank into a smear of muted colour behind them. Captain Rousseau, a wiry man with a thick beard and sharper eyes, navigated the trawler with the ease of someone born to the water. He didn't ask why they were charting a course into the abyss. He didn't want to know. Early on, as they passed the last channel marker, he spat overboard and muttered something about bad water and places best left undisturbed, but didn't elaborate. Ethan stayed close to the equipment inside the cabin, checking and rechecking the sonar setup they had hastily secured. Every hour that passed deepened the sense of isolation. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, the sky and sea merging into a single, unbroken sheet of iron grey. By noon, the last fishing vessels disappeared from radar. They were truly alone now. The first signs came in flickers. The compass needle on the bridge spun wildly, refusing to hold a steady bearing. Electrical interference crackled through the radio at random intervals, sharp bursts of static that made conversation near impossible. "Magnetic anomalies," Ethan said grimly, studying the failing instruments. "Not natural ones." Captain Rousseau swore under his breath, but kept the trawler steady. Clara watched the sonar screen, the blue-black sweep revealing the ocean floor below, flat and featureless at first, then abruptly plunging into a dark canyon so deep the sonar return flickered and faded. The abyss. Even the name felt insufficient. Standing here, hovering on the edge of it, it wasn't just a trench, it was an open mouth, yawning beneath them, swallowing light, swallowing sound, swallowing history. Clara's hands tightened around the railing. Somewhere down there was the azure horizon. The winch whined as they lowered the drone into the water, its small camera light cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. Clara and Ethan crowded around the monitor in the cabin as the footage came in. Blurred swirls of plankton, shifting schools of silver fish, darting past the lens. The deeper the drone descended, the less life they saw. At 600 meters, the abyss revealed itself. Sheer cliffs of basalt and crumbling silt, jagged outcroppings like teeth. Then, without warning, the silhouette of a ship materialized in the gloom. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't wreckage, not in the sense they had imagined. The azure horizon sat eerily upright on a rocky ledge, its once gleaming white hull now stained a sickly grey. Windows blown out, lifeboat stations empty. Parts of the upper decks had collapsed inward, but the overall structure remained disturbingly intact, as if it had simply decided to lie down and wait. Ethan muttered under his breath, adjusting the drone's angle to sweep along the starboard side. It's staged, like someone arranged it. Clara didn't respond. She couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. It was reckless, dangerous. Every warning shouted for them to turn back, but they didn't. The small dinghy bobbed in the swells as Clara, Ethan, and Rousseau geared up. Wetsuits, oxygen tanks, and a tether system linking them back to the sea serpent. The water was bitterly cold, sapping warmth from their bodies the moment they submerged. The wreck loomed larger as they descended, the massive structure blotting out what little light filtered down from the surface. They entered through a gaping rent in the side, torn open like a wound, and found themselves inside the belly of the dead ship. The interior of the azure horizon was a graveyard. Tables, still bolted to the dining hall floors, were set with corroded silverware, cups long empty. Personal belongings floated lazily in the stagnant water, a cracked cell phone, a single high-heeled shoe, and drifting near the waterlogged ceiling of a flooded cabin, a child's brightly coloured teddy bear, its button eyes staring blankly into the darkness. But it wasn't just the objects, it was the bodies. Dozens of them, scattered along the main corridors and stairwells, slumped against walls or curled in corners, faces bloated and pale, preserved by the unnatural cold and depth.
And the doors. Every major access point to the crew quarters, the bridge, the engine room had been chained shut from the inside. Heavy steel chains looped through handles, secured with rusted padlocks. Clara stared at the chains, nausea coiling low in her gut. "They trapped themselves in," she said over the radio, her voice little more than a whisper. Ethan's voice crackled back. "Or someone trapped them. Either way, the message is clear. They weren't trying to keep something out.
They were trying to keep something in." Near the bridge, Ethan located the ship's data recorder, the black box. It was embedded deep into the wall behind the captain's chair, half buried under fallen beams. It took nearly 30 minutes of careful maneuvering, cutting away debris, before they pried it loose. Back aboard the Sea Serpent, Ethan wasted no time connecting it to a portable playback device. The first several minutes were routine: coordinates, weather updates, mundane crew chatter. Then the recordings shifted, faint shouting, static, something heavy slamming against metal, voices overlapping, frantic and unintelligible. Ethan boosted the gain, filtering out the worst of the noise. A male voice, the captain, they assumed, barked commands. "Seal it off! No one opens those doors! I don't care what you hear! No one opens them!" Another voice, younger, broken with fear. "They're not dead! They're still moving!" A third voice, distorted almost beyond recognition, screamed in the background. The recording ended abruptly with a violent, metallic screech, as if something massive had torn through the ship itself. Clara sat frozen, staring at the speaker. It wasn't supernatural forces at work here. It was human terror, pure and raw. Something had gone catastrophically wrong aboard the Azure Horizon. Not just technical failure, but something that turned the crew against each other. Paranoia, violence, fear. They pulled away from the wreck site under a heavy, leaden sky, the Azure Horizon growing smaller behind them, sinking once more into the depths of the abyss. Clara sat near the stern, the black box clutched tightly in her lap. The weight of it was immense, not just physically, but what it represented. Proof, evidence, answers that had been buried for 10 years. The Sea Serpent rocked gently at anchor while Ethan reviewed the black box audio again, passing fragments frame by frame, voice by voice. Clara sat across from him, piecing together old manifests, shipping orders, and fragments of the falsified records they'd gathered in Port Caldwell. As she compared cargo lists, a detail caught her attention. A single entry hastily added to the bottom of the Azure Horizon's pre-departure manifest, labeled simply, "Scientific materials, fragile, no weight listed, no description, no destination port." Clara highlighted it, her pulse quickening. "This wasn't standard cargo," she said. The faint, smudged logo she'd seen earlier in the archives flashed in her mind. The Trident. Ethan leaned over, scanning the page. "That's not linens or food supplies." Together they traced the shipment to a private holding company connected to a mining consortium operating in the South Pacific, Titan Maritime Solutions, an outfit with a history of deep-sea excavation projects, many of them shuttered quietly after environmental violations. One project in particular stood out, an unauthorized dig in an ancient seabed trench, a dig that had been abruptly abandoned after an unexplained incident. There had been no public reports, no scientific papers, just a terse final entry in a leaked corporate memo. Recovery successful, transfer discreetly, no exposure. Clara sat back, heart thudding. The Trident logo belonged to Titan. They smuggled something onto the ship, something they weren't supposed to find or move. It was Captain Rousseau who first mentioned it again later that night, as they gathered around a small table in the galley, eating cold sandwiches and sipping burnt coffee. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You know the old stories about these waters, right?" he said, glancing around. "About the deep man?" Clara exchanged a glance with Ethan before nodding cautiously. "We've heard the name. That's about it." Rousseau shrugged, a rough laugh escaping him. "Old sailor's tale, goes back centuries. Says there's something down there. Not a monster, not a ghost, just something wrong. They say if you stay too long near the abyss, you start hearing things, seeing shadows that aren't there. Crew turns on each other. Madness takes hold." Clara listened carefully, filing the information away. The story was useful, not because it was true, but because it had likely been weaponized, an easy way to excuse human failures. Fear had a way of erasing inconvenient facts. "You believe it?" Ethan asked casually. Rousseau shook his head, but his eyes were wary. "I believe people need something to blame when things go sideways." Clara thought about the locked doors aboard the Azure Horizon, the desperate cries caught on the black box, the chains securing the cabins. She believed something had broken the crew's minds, but it wasn't folklore. It was fear, amplified, encouraged by those who needed silence more than survival. They docked late the next afternoon, slipping into a private marina far from town to avoid drawing attention. Clara carried the black box recorder under her jacket, hyper-aware of every shadow, every passing figure. Ethan checked the perimeter before they headed toward the lot where they had parked his truck. It felt almost normal, the end of a long trip, until the man stepped out from behind the loading bay. He wore a nondescript jacket and jeans, but there was nothing casual about the way he moved, precise, coiled. His face was hard and unreadable, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses despite the overcast sky. His shoes were impeccably polished, gleaming oddly against the grimy dockside concrete. Clara slowed instinctively. "Clara Hayes," the man said evenly. "Ethan Cole. I'm going to need you to hand over the device you recovered." Ethan stepped slightly in front of her. "And who exactly are you?" The man smiled thinly, a humorless curl of the lip. "You know who I represent." Clara shifted her weight subtly, glancing past the man. Two more figures waited by a black SUV nearby, engines idled, doors stood open. Not police, not contractors, corporate muscle. Ethan kept his voice steady. "Not happening." The agent's hand twitched toward his jacket, not fast, but enough to make the threat clear. Clara acted first. She yanked Ethan's arm, spinning them both toward the narrow alley between two warehouses. Shouts erupted behind them, footsteps pounding pavement. They ran flat out, weaving between shipping containers and stacks of rotting pallets. A truck roared past, momentarily blocking their pursuers' line of sight. Ethan jerked Clara behind a dumpster, both of them gasping for breath. "They won't stop," she said, voice low and furious. "They'll keep coming." Ethan nodded grimly. "Then we hit them first." They made it to the truck only because Rousseau, anticipating trouble, had kept the engine warm and ready. Within minutes, they were back on the highway, speeding north towards safer ground. Clara clutched the black box like a lifeline, mind racing faster than the wheels beneath them. The pieces were finally fitting together. Titan Maritime Solutions, the secret excavation, the rush shipment smuggled aboard the Azure Horizon, the violent collapse of the crew, the desperate cover-up, the deliberate manipulation of fear with stories like the deep man myth to explain away madness. And now, the desperate attempts to retrieve or destroy the evidence before it could surface. Clara's hands tightened into fists. They weren't just fighting for answers anymore. They were fighting to rip the mask off an entire operation, to expose the network of corporations, officials, and silent partners who had gambled with 2,000 lives and thought they could get away with it. "We go public," she said, breathing hard. "Not with pieces, not with rumors, with everything. The recordings, the black box, the sonar data. We name names." Ethan's jaw set in a hard line. "And we better be ready when they hit back." Ahead, the highway stretched out in a long, empty ribbon, leading them away from safety and deeper into the fire. But Clara no longer cared. The safe house Ethan arranged was an abandoned cabin 30 miles inland, tucked deep into a grove of pine trees. It wasn't much, a single room, no electricity beyond what the generator sputtered out, a battered wood stove in the corner. But it gave them breathing room. Clara set up her laptop on the scarred kitchen table using a mobile hotspot and a stack of burner phones. The black box was stored safely inside a metal case beside her, while Ethan prowled the perimeter outside, checking for any signs they had been followed. Hours blurred together as Clara dug deeper into the records, the falsified manifests, the hidden corporate memos, the trail left behind by careless bureaucrats who never imagined anyone would come looking a decade later. The cruise line, Neptune Voyages, had been floundering financially even before the azure horizon vanished, quietly bleeding money, hemorrhaging investors. But just months before the doomed voyage, a sudden influx of cash had flooded the company, anonymous shell companies, most traced through offshore accounts and tax shelters, names that didn't appear on any press releases or company brochures, and buried in the ownership structures masked through 3 layers of dummy corporations, Titan Maritime Solutions. Clara leaned back, her heart hammering. The same consortium involved in illegal deep-sea excavations, the same one tied to the forbidden artifact dredged from the ocean floor. Neptune Voyages had never been saved. It had been bought, turned into a disposable delivery system to transport whatever Titan wanted hidden. The passengers were collateral damage, nothing more. Ethan returned as the sun dropped below the tree line, a shotgun slung over his shoulder, his expression grim. Clara didn't waste time. She showed him the flowchart she had built, linking the corporations, the cruise line, the mining project. At first, Ethan said nothing. He just stared at the screen, jaw tightening. "They never intended to find the azure horizon," Clara said quietly. "That's why the searches were half-hearted, why the investigations dried up so fast. They controlled it from the beginning." Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "I thought—" He shook his head, the old self-doubt flickering in his eyes. "I thought I missed something, that I wasn't good enough, that I'd failed them." Clara's voice softened. "They set you up to fail." For years, Ethan had carried that guilt like an anchor. It had cost him his career, his reputation, even his belief in himself. And now, looking at him across the small table in the fading light, Clara realized it had almost cost him everything. "You didn't fail, Ethan," she said. "You were the only one who got close to the truth." Ethan's mouth twisted in a grim smile. "Close enough for them to destroy me before I found it." They worked through the night, cataloguing everything. Clara built digital folders containing scans of the journal pages, sonar images of the wreck, the recovered black box audio files, and the tangled web of corporate documents she had traced. Ethan compiled a timeline, every missing report, every altered log, every corporate acquisition that tied back to Titan Maritime. They set up multiple redundancies, cloud backups under false accounts, encrypted thumb drives hidden in different locations. If something happened to them, the truth would survive. They weren't naive. Once they went public, it would trigger a storm. And the people behind this, the ones who had killed 2,000 passengers without blinking, wouldn't hesitate to do worse to two persistent investigators. Emma stared at the glowing laptop screen as she drafted the press release. It wasn't just a story, it was a reckoning. The first sign came at dawn. Clara's phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway, half expecting more threats. Instead, a clipped voice identified itself as a reporter from the Harbour Chronicle, requesting comment on her alleged fabricated evidence regarding the Azure Horizon. Before she could respond, the caller hung up. Within an hour, an article appeared online, anonymous sources claiming that Clara Hayes and Ethan Cole were exploiting a national tragedy for personal gain, fabricating evidence, and engaging in conspiracy mongering. Photos of Clara, taken without her knowledge, accompanied the story. Grainy surveillance shots from the marina, a zoomed-in image of her crossing the parking lot with Ethan. Ethan cursed softly as they read through the hit piece. "They're trying to discredit us before we can even speak." Clara closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "Then we speak louder." The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and adrenaline. Clara sat before the laptop, fingers poised over the keyboard, the Go Live button blinking back at her. Ethan hovered nearby, triple-checking that the backup streams were armed and ready. No turning back now, no more what-ifs. This was the moment they pushed the truth into the world, where no corporation, no smear campaign, no hit piece could drag it back into the dark. Clara took a slow breath, steadying herself. Then she clicked the button. The feed went live across 3 separate platforms simultaneously, uncensored, unedited, unstoppable. The opening screen displayed the sonar scans, the abyss, the lifeless hulk of the Azure Horizon resting like a tombstone against the ocean floor. Side-by-side images flashed, original shipping manifests versus the doctored ones, corporate acquisition trails linking Neptune voyages back to Titan Maritime Solutions. Then the video shifted. Black box audio played through raw speakers. The terror, the confusion, the frantic orders to seal off the ship's compartments. A timeline scrolled beneath the footage. May 2015, ship departs. May 2015, last known transmission. June 2015, search terminated. July 2015, corporate buyout finalized. Names, dates, documents, voices, all laid bare. Clara watched the comment feed explode, thousands of viewers pouring in, some confused, some furious, all locked onto the unfolding truth. At exactly the 45-minute mark, the footage shifted again. Something Clara hadn't seen until Ethan unearthed it from the corrupted black box files during their last review. The screen turned shaky, handheld, blurry at first, then sharpening into the terrified face of her brother Liam. Clara's breath caught painfully in her throat. She barely registered Ethan's hand gripping her shoulder, steady, grounding as the recording played. Liam sat huddled in a narrow maintenance corridor, the dim emergency lighting casting harsh shadows across his face. Behind him, metal bulkheads groaned under unseen pressure. His voice cracked, but was determined. "If anyone finds this, please, don't believe what they tell you. We weren't lost. We were buried." He looked down briefly, as if struggling with the weight of his words, then forced his gaze back to the camera. They brought something aboard. It wasn't natural, but it wasn't magic either. It's greed. It's people willing to kill for it. A distant crash echoed in the background. Liam flinched but held the camera steady. "Don't let them bury the truth, not again." The video ended in a sudden lurch, the screen freezing on Liam's face mid-breath before fading into static. Clara sat frozen. The room around her dissolved. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her brother's voice, reaching out across the chasm of 10 lost years. The fallout was immediate. Whistleblowers came forward, men and women who had worked on the search, pushed out when they asked too many questions, retired Coast Guards, dock workers who had loaded mysterious, unmarked crates onto the ship, even a junior executive from Titan admitting the artifact had been intended for private sale to the highest bidder. Arrest warrants were issued before sunset for executives at Neptune Voyages, mid-level managers at Titan Maritime, and even a few government contractors who had falsified reports. Clara watched from the battered couch in the safe house as agents in dark windbreakers led suited men out of their homes in handcuffs, watched the news anchors struggle to put into words the enormity of what had been uncovered. The next morning, Clara sat on the steps outside the cabin, watching the sunrise. Ethan joined her, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He didn't speak at first. He just sat beside her, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Finally, he said, "We did it." Clara nodded slowly. "We did. It wasn't enough to bring Liam back. It wasn't enough to undo the years lost. But it was enough to make sure no one forgot again." They had turned grief into action, guilt into truth, silence into a roar that no amount of money or fear could smother. Clara held her brother's words close to her heart, the last gift he had managed to send through the abyss, and she hadn't let them bury it. Not this time, not ever again. The collapse of Titan Maritime Solutions was as swift as it was total. In the weeks following the broadcast, investigators raided corporate offices across 3 continents. Financial records, internal emails, private communications, all laid bare. The media devoured the story. Every day brought new revelations, bribes paid to search officials, hush money funneled to grieving families, secret salvage deals masked under environmental permits. Public trust cratered, stockholders fled, board members resigned under flashing cameras and shouted questions. Clara watched it unfold from a quiet distance, declining interviews, refusing awards. The victory wasn't sweet, it was necessary. What mattered more were the quiet gatherings. Families coming together at makeshift memorials, reading the names of the azure horizons lost aloud under open skies. This time, their voices were heard. This time, there were no half-hearted condolences or hollow explanations. There was truth, and for many, that was finally enough. Clara found herself walking the shoreline more often now. There was something soothing about the steady pull of the tide, the endless murmur of waves smoothing over broken shells and stones, a reminder that no matter how violent the past, life moved forward. The morning was crisp, the sun rising in soft gold over the horizon when she spotted something bobbing among the kelp at the water's edge. A bottle, clear glass, battered by the sea, a faded cork pressed tight into the mouth. Inside, a slip of paper curled against the glass. Curious, Clara waded into the cold surf, heart thudding for reasons she couldn't explain. She pried the cork loose and carefully fished out the paper, hands trembling slightly. The writing was faded but unmistakable, Liam's handwriting. 2 lines, simple and sure, still with you, always. At the bottom, a date, 2 weeks ago. Clara stood there a long time, the bottle cradled to her chest, the ocean whispering around her ankles. She didn't know how it was possible, didn't care. Some things weren't meant to be explained. Some echoes travelled further than reason could follow. She smiled through tears she didn't bother to wipe away, and turned back toward the shore, the morning light breaking clean and clear over the world she had fought so hard to change.